massive day, obviously, across the pond in America with Joe Biden, who will be having his inauguration ceremony today. Very strange one. There'll be very few members of the public, obviously. There will be a lot of flags instead of the people who would have been lining the pathway in front of him. There are going to be more military people protecting the new president today than are currently operational for America around the world in various places, which is an extraordinary statistic. Richard Gaisford is out there for us. Richard, this is one of the strangest inauguration ceremonies that we can ever remember, isn't it? Normally you're used to seeing hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets cheering the new president. This time it's just 25,000 members of the National Guard and a lot of flags.
Yes, and Washington itself very much a ghost town. Apart from that military activity, we've been watching hundreds of troops coming and going this morning, Piers, into the capital. Here, of course, to deter the most extreme of President Trump supporters from trying to disrupt the proceedings. He, of course, will not be here today, breaking with tradition, flying on Air Force One for the last time down to Florida this morning. But he has just released a full list of pardons, and it's interesting. Steve Bannon, the controversial former chief strategist, has been pardoned, and he will now not face trial for fraudulent use of money that had been raised for that border wall.
That's interesting, Richard. Have you got any other details on the others on the list of 100 pardons? Because we were speaking earlier this week about whether Julian Assange might be mentioned on it.
No mention of Julian Assange. There are 73 people who've been given full pardons. 70 have had their sentences fully commuted. Most of them are related to the president's political business in terms of people who've been raising funds, had got themselves into trouble. It is a pretty murky world that had been going on around. A lot of trials of his supporters and key associates, and through loyalty to him,
Richard,
they have now been
let me
pardoned.
jump in there. I don't give a stuff, frankly, about Trump anymore.
Well, I think it's pretty significant what he's done
not really.
to justice and 100 pardons.
The pardon system is ridiculous in America. Every president does it. I don't care.
I think we have a good reason to be interested in what he does on the way out.
Yeah, but pardoning people, they all do it.
Well,
Obama
pardoning
did it.
people so that
Clinton
they don't face justice. They
all pardon dodgy people. Here's why I don't care. I care more about the new guy. Because today we get a new president, we get a chance to, put the Trump era behind us. And I was really struck yesterday by an incredibly moving little speech that he gave in Delaware, which, of course, is where he's from in America. And in particular, the way he talked about his son, Beau, who died from a brain cancer about 6 years ago. And it was very emotional. Let's take a look.
I am even more proud to be standing here doing this from the Major Beau Biden facility. Ladies and gentlemen, I only have one regret. He's not here, because we should be introducing him as president.
You know, Richard, I wrote a column, I remember when Beau Biden died, saying he was the best president America will never now know it could have had. And Joe Biden rang me. I wrote about this for the Mail on Sunday, and Joe Biden rang me to thank me, and we talked about his son. His son was such an impressive young man. He'd been a state's attorney general. He'd been a war hero in Iraq. He was a handsome, intelligent, charming guy with a beautiful wife and kids, and it all got snuffed away. And, of course, what made it doubly worse for Joe Biden was that when he was a 29-year-old about to become a US senator, one of the youngest in history, he lost his wife and his baby daughter in a car crash and had to bring up these two boys, Beau and Hunter, on his own until he met his lovely second wife, Jill. And the deep empathy that Joe Biden has, my God, does America not need that now? I mean, this is a country ravaged by coronavirus, ravaged by the fallout to the George Floyd death and all the protests that followed, ravaged by a president refusing to accept the result of a democratic election and inciting an insurrection at the US Capitol. And when I watched Joe Biden yesterday, it just reminded me that he's a man of deep empathy, and it's based on deep personal loss. And I found it very emotional watching him.
Oh, we saw that, Piers, last night here in Washington, down on the Mall, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial by the reflecting pool. The most emotional service given. To think of those nearly 400,000 Americans who have died from coronavirus. It is the biggest challenge that this president is facing. The pandemic is ravaging this country. It is tearing the economy to bits. And he stood there and you sense the change of tone. And we're thinking, you know, in 24 hours' time, he will be president and he will be leading in a very different way.
Yeah. Well, Richard, thanks very much indeed. But it's interesting your view of Trump, Piers, because you've already said, you know, you got him wrong to a certain extent. And I know now you almost want to, you know, bang the door behind him and keep it closed. But Trump isn't going anywhere.
No,
I mean,
no,
he's
no.
going to be causing trouble on the sidelines.
He's already talking about launching his Patriots Party and all the rest
He
of it.
says the movement that they've started has only just begun.
Yeah. Now, my theory is Trump literally was sent mad by what happened in the last 12 months. He felt he was heading to an easy re-election, which I think he was in many ways last January. Then he was hit by the pandemic, which has been a disaster, mainly thanks to his terrible leadership. The George Floyd thing exposed again his complete lack of ability to show empathy with the American people.
Well, he's a narcissistic personality, isn't he?
Of course.
It's all about him and his personal ability. He doesn't trust institutions. He doesn't trust democratic conventions. And once he realised his personal touch had no effect when it came to the COVID pandemic, he didn't know what to do. And he just wanted to discredit anyone like Dr. Fauci, for instance, who might actually have some expertise.
Let's be clear. The guy's been a total disaster in the last 12 months. And any attempt to defend his antics in the last 2-3 months in particular, I'm just not having it. The guy has tried to basically destroy American democracy. Anyway,
he's been charged with inciting an insurrection.
And I hope the Senate convict him, because he needs to be stopped from running again. And American presidents need to be shown that the instrument of power in America is actually there in Congress and can actually keep them to account. ITV's Washington correspondent, Robert Moore, had one of the most extraordinary reports that I've ever seen, frankly, which was during the US Capitol riots as it happened. Robert, you were in the thick of it. You are one of the most experienced correspondents we have here at ITV, but even for you, that moment as that mob stormed inside past you, what was that like to be around?
Well, I mean, Piers, you know, I've seen mobs and I've seen riots in many parts of the world, but we did have to pinch ourselves and recognise this is the US Capitol. And it did feel surreal that the very seat of American democracy, the People's House, as they call Congress, was being invaded like that. So yes, it gave us a real sense of just how ominous the future could be with a country facing such a severe political rift. And I think that's true. You know, we feel that even more today as we go into this inauguration. You know, it's meant to be a peaceful celebration of the transfer of power. Instead, we recognize there will be millions of people watching this event today who actually, in reality, believe that it was a fraud. They don't believe this election was anything other than stolen. In other words, they completely buy into Donald Trump's narrative, and that certainly is overshadowing this day.
It's very interesting, Robert, isn't it, what now happens to Trump and what Biden wants to do about Trump, because Trump clearly is not going anywhere. He's going to launch apparently a rival party, the Patriots Party, he's suggesting. But it's a very interesting situation evolving now, I think, in the Senate, surrounding the Republican majority leader there until today, obviously, Mitch McConnell, who went on the attack yesterday in a way I've never heard him before. In the first impeachment a year ago over alleged Russian collusion, he was rock solid behind Trump. No senator budged. Mitch McConnell yesterday directly linking the president's lies and rhetoric to the insurrection at the Capitol. Now, if that translates into him voting to convict Trump in the Senate, I would imagine that Mitch McConnell, given his power in the Senate, can bring at least 16 more Republican senators with him.
Which is how many he needs.
Which is how many he would need to add to the Democrats to get to be 67 out of the 100 you need to have a successful conviction. And if Trump is convicted, he becomes the first president in US history to be convicted in impeachment. Richard Nixon never reached that stage. And secondly, he would be prevented from running again. What impact could that have do you think, on Trump's ability to have a rival party and so on?
I think you're right, Piers, to identify that Mitch McConnell speech last night is a big moment, because if he can bring those other senators, Republican senators, with him, then we are looking at the very real possibility of conviction and indeed of barring Donald Trump from ever standing for federal office again. And then just imagine what that does to America's political divide and to Donald Trump's sort of alienated supporters. Does that really bring a rift, not just to the Republican Party, but to the American people? And therefore, there is a prospect that Joe Biden's first 100 days, for example, are significantly overshadowed. So, even though Donald Trump has now left office, even though, in a few hours' time he'll be heading down to Florida, it does raise the very real possibility he will now project himself as some kind of, leader in exile,
Robert,
and try and rally his supporters.
Tell us about that moment when you're in the Capitol, because Donald Trump has not just whipped his supporters up against the result of the election, but also against journalists. And we know, I think you mention in your report that, some of the senators, some of the politicians are, sort of hate figures for this mob, some of whom were armed, who got into the Capitol. What was the atmosphere like when you were in there? And it just struck me how frightening, frankly, it must have been for you and the politicians inside.
It was concerning. We did cross a message on the doors of Congress which said, "Murder the media." And we were aware that, members of Congress, senators, staff and aides were all hiding in the basement behind locked doors. So, yes, there was a sense that democracy was being hijacked by that mob. But it's also important to recognize, Susanna and Piers, that, for many of those rioters, they didn't have a sense of themselves intruding on Congress. They were shouting, "Our house, our house." They had this sense of ownership of Congress. So while we see them as rioters, insurrectionists, and a mob, they saw themselves in totally different terms.
And they also, Robert, they also saw themselves as doing what their president told them to do. And what's very interesting, I think, legally, and another reason, I would argue, why the Senate needs to convict Trump, you can't have a situation where thousands of Americans have acted on what they believe were the direct instructions of their president to march down to the Capitol, to fight for him and to stop the steal, as Trump put it repeatedly, that they, in their eyes, then went and did that. They all get prosecuted and jailed, but the man who incited it gets off scot-free. And I think that is the question I would put to Mitch McConnell and the other Republicans, because their oath under an impeachment is very different to anything else. We saw this with the Russian collusion impeachment. They take an oath when they go into an impeachment trial, which requires impartial justice. They're to put aside their partisanship and they're to put the American Constitution and law first. And I just don't see how you can let the inciter off and prosecute all the people he incited.
That's the exquisite dilemma, isn't it, Piers, for Republican senators? Do they vote to convict him? Probably almost certainly signing their own political death warrant, if you like, because Trump supporters will then abandon them. Or do they hold to their moral conscience and worry about their historic reputation? So it is an exquisite dilemma for Republican senators as they make the most difficult choice of their lives in the coming days. Do they vote for conviction of the president or the former president?
Yeah, well, it's an extraordinary situation. Robert, your report went around the world. It was by far the most extraordinary report from that remarkable day. It will go down in infamy, sadly, now, as one of the worst days in American history.
And the extended report, Storming the Capitol, is on ITV Player. And honestly, if you want to get a sense of what it was actually like and an assault on democracy feels like in the moment, and if you want to go back to living through that moment of history, watch it on ITV.
If you want to know what it takes to be a correspondent like Robert Moore, watch the extended version and understand what courage on the front line for the media in a mob that wants to murder the media looks like. Robert, I was awestruck, frankly, by what you did that day. It was correspondent reporting at its very best. So thank you for what you did and for showing us in real time what was actually going on there. It was remarkable.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Piers.
Good to talk to you. Well, it's going to be an amazing...
Get some rest, because it's going to be a big day.
Yeah.
Susanna, you're right. It will be a big day. There's a pretty, as Richard was saying, a pretty ominous feeling here with 25,000 troops on the streets. You know, this is not doesn't feel like a day of joy or a political celebration.
No, but sleeping's cheating for you correspondents. You all boast about that. You live off an hour a day. We know that. Good luck today, Rob. It's going to be a momentous day.